Hi everyone, this video is for Lab 2 and today I'll be showing you how to create an interactive form using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. For this assignment, the idea is to create something similar to a BuzzFeed quiz. Now, if you don't know what a BuzzFeed quiz is, I have opened up the BuzzFeed page and opened up the quizzes tab. And here you'll see a couple of quizzes ranging from, stuff about Marvel to trivia to anime to Disney, basically quizzes about anything. So I'm going to open up one of the examples here. All right, so this quiz down here says, would you rather Disney edition? If you open it up, it asks you a couple of questions about Disney related things. And when you go through them and answer all the questions, at the end of it, you get a result back which tells you what Disney character you are most like. Essentially, that's all a BuzzFeed quiz is. It tells you a little bit about your personality. Now, these quizzes are in no means, ground in any sort of personality theory. It's just a bunch of fun quizzes that people make on the internet. And that's what we'll be doing for this lab. In order to do this, I will show you how to create and style a form using HTML and CSS like you learned in the first lab. And then we'll use simple JavaScript code to fetch the data from that form and display it on a web page. Before we begin, I'm going to introduce a new concept called the DOM. DOM in this instance stands for Document Object Model. Specifically, we're talking about the HTML DOM. The HTML DOM is constructed as a tree of objects. It helps to define HTML elements as objects, events for HTML elements as objects, properties for HTML objects, methods for HTML elements. And the reason this is important is because then we can use JavaScript to manipulate that DOM and create very dynamic web pages. This diagram here helps to create a better visual representation of that HTML DOM and that tree that I was talking about. So the HTML DOM starts off with the document. The document is essentially your browser window. So each tab is its own document, which is being loaded with its own HTML content. So if you can imagine you have multiple tabs open, each of those tabs, as we saw in the previous lab, are essentially just HTML pages being loaded. And the root of each page is the entire document, which is its own object. Now, this document contains a bunch of HTML elements. If you remember from the first lab, the root element, so every single thing in your HTML page, essentially has to be contained in this HTML tag. And that's what we call the root element. Now that HTML tag can contain the head tag and it can also contain the body tag. These are two elements within that larger root element. Now within each of those elements, you can have your own elements as well. So for example, in the head element here, we have a title. In the body element here, we have h1 tag, p tag, and an image tag. And now each of those elements themselves have their own content. So this h1 tag has a text that says I'm a heading, and it has an attribute that says align to the center. As you can imagine, this tree can grow and become as deep or as wide as you want it to be. So you can have as many elements as you want under each branch of this tree. Now, of course, this is a very simplified version of the DOM, but the reason why this is really important to us is because JavaScript allows us to manipulate this DOM and do very interesting things. For example, you can set the color of the page to change every single time it loads. And we would do that by calling a method on the document itself, not on any specific tag. Another thing you could do is write a bunch of if statements that change the code on your page. So a bunch of if statements that could change the structure of this tree to show up in different ways depending on certain inputs. And these are some of the things that we'll focus on today. In this video, I'll break things up into 3 different sections. So first, we'll create a form that allows users to enter inputs. Then we'll write something that can read that input, manipulate that data, and perform certain actions. Then finally, we'll do some styling and make our form look good. So the first thing you need to do is download the Lab02 zip file, which we have provided on Canvas. If you would like to, I would recommend coding along with me so that you can pause and rewind and make corrections as you go along. So open up the zip file, and then we'll open up that folder. So the folder that you've opened should have 4 different files in it and 1 folder. So we have form.html, index.css, index.js, and results.html. And we have this images folder that's essentially empty. In this video, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, which is the recommended editor, but feel free to use any other editor that you used for Lab 1 if you're more comfortable with that. So we'll start off with form.html. Very first thing we'll do is to create our HTML tag. And then we'll set up the head and the body of the file. So head, and then body. In here, we'll add the title tag. And I'm going to make the title my name, which you should also do. So before starting, I would recommend thinking about what you want to write about. So thinking about what you want your topic to be to help you move through things quicker and focus on specific things. So my topic is going to be about TV shows. I'm going to ask a couple of questions relating to TV shows, and depending on people's responses to those questions, I'm going to tell them whether I think, they have basic taste, or whether they have great taste, or whether they have like an elite taste. And these are the type of questions I'm going to be writing about. To create a form in HTML, we use the form tag. This form tag can contain as many elements as we want. And so we'll start off with a title and a short description. And we'll do this using the h1 tag for a title. So my title is going to be, what do your TV show preferences say about you? And then my short description is going to say, your favorite show says a lot about you. Answer these questions so we can find out who you really are. Okay. So we have our heading tag and our paragraph tab. Now, if you remember from the previous lab, to run an HTML file, all you have to do is go to the folder where you have your file saved and open it up with any browser of your choice. I'm going to use Google Chrome for this. All right, so it looks exactly like we wanted to. So we have a heading that says, what do your TV show preferences say about you? And then we have our description that says this. So now we'll go ahead and write our questions. In HTML, forms can have multiple inputs. So you can have text boxes, drop-down menus, checkboxes, and so on. So we're going to write a couple of them, and I'll start off with a text box. We create an input by using the input tag. Inside of this tag, we can specify the type of input we're looking for. So in this case, we want a text input. Another thing that's important to add is an ID. So this ID will identify this impute. And because I want this impute to essentially ask for a user's first name, I'm going to name this ID fname. One last thing that's important to include is a name. Now, what this name does is it essentially acts as a variable so that you can call the data that was entered into that impute, and we'll see how that becomes useful later on. So in this case, I'll also set the name to fname. All right, now I'm going to refresh my window. And as you can see, we've created this text box and you can enter any imputes. So a lot of the times, we don't want our imputes to stand alone. We usually have like an associated question with them. And so we can do that using a label. Now in this label, I'm going to write the question, what is your name? And inside the label opening tag, right? So in these brackets, we need to add a couple of important attributes. So the first one being the for attribute. What this does is it helps to relate an associated label with the corresponding input field. And in this case, we've set the ID of our input field to fname. And so we have to set fname as the same value inside of these attributes. And I'll show you what that does in a second. So now we have the label that says, what's your name? And then the text box right beside it that we can, put in our answer to this question. Now, the reason why this for attribute was very important is because over here, if we click on what's your name, it automatically highlights the input box that corresponds to that question, right? So now HTML understands that this question belongs to this input box, and whatever answer you put into this input box relates to this question. The next input type I'm going to talk about is a number type. So we'll use the same input tag, and this time we'll say the type is number. We'll give it an ID of amount. And then, like the previous inputs, we also have to have a name, and I'll just set it to the same as the ID. Now in this case, I want to use this input to ask users how many TV shows they watch. So I'm going to add an associated label, pair that up with the input type by using the ID. And then the question in here is going to be, how many TV shows you watch? If I reload this, we have another question. So it says, how many TV shows do you watch? And then it has an associated box beside it. If you notice, when you click on this box, it has a couple of arrows. That's the difference between a text box and a number box. For the input type number, there's a couple of other interesting attributes that we can add. So for example, we can add a step and set it to 2, let's say. What this does is that when you click on these arrows, it will then increment the numbers by 2. So we go from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 and then to 10. The default step is 1, which is why I did it by 1 before. So I'm just going to leave it as 1. In Lab 1, we talked about how it's good practice to divide your code up into sections just to keep your work organized and to help you add specific styling attributes to those sections. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to separate each question by a div just to help me visually understand, the different sections and the different questions. So I'm going to add a div tag here, and I'll copy my code and put it in that div tag. Make sure your indentations are right. Then I'll add another div tag. And then also put this in here. The next NP type we're going to talk about is checkboxes. So I'm going to create my div. Before I start coding, we're going to talk a bit about checkboxes. Checkboxes work a bit differently from the previous two NP types that we've talked about. For a checkbox, it's called a multi-option type of question. And so you're presenting the users with a couple of options, and they can either select multiple or they can select one. For this reason, the impute works differently here. So we'll have our impute tag. The type will be checkbox. Now, for this next question, I'm going to ask users what their favorite TV genres are. So I'm going to include options like comedy, drama, documentary, action and adventure. And so I'm going to set the ID relating to either of those genres. And so the ID here is going to be comedy, because that's the first one I'm going to include. I'm going to make the name here genres, and I'll explain a bit about that later. And I'm going to introduce a new attribute called value. And I'll set this value to the same as the ID, which is comedy. So if I run this code, notice that it's only a square box that shows up, right? So it's just the checkbox. And usually when you have checkboxes, they have an associated value with them, right? So users want to know, oh, what am I selecting? What am I clicking on? To add those values, we'll also use labels, right? So we'll use a label tag. Now I want this label to say comedy because that's the first option. And then remember, we have to use the for attribute, and the for attribute has to match the ID of the associated input. So I'm going to set this to comedy. And now once I save this and run it, comedy is associated with this checkbox. And so if I click on the text comedy, it's going to click on the checkbox. And if I click on the checkbox, it basically takes off comedy. Now notice how here we used a label for the checkbox, but in the previous ones, we used a label for the question. In this case, when it comes to checkboxes, when it comes to multi-option questions, you can use a paragraph to set what the question is. And so I'm going to say, which TV genres do you enjoy? Now, once I save this and run it, the question is, which TV genres do you enjoy? And then the first option is comedy. So I'm going to add a couple more options to this. Now I'm going to use all of these to explain why we included the name attribute and why we made the name attributes the same for all of these options. The reason why is because we want our browser to be able to note that all of these options are related to the same question. So remember, before we had to find some way to connect the input to the label, right? And we did that using the ID attribute and the for attributes. But now we also want to be able to say all of these options are related to each other. And so in this case, we use the name attribute for that. And that's the reason why they're all the same. So if I save this and I run it, you see my question and you see all the 4 different options under that question. The next type is going to be a radio button. So again, I'll add my div. And because radio buttons are another multi-option type question, I'm going to use a paragraph to set my question. So here I'm going to ask, what's your favorite medical show? These are very similar to checkboxes in the way that we write the options. So I'm going to write the input, set the type to radio button. The first ID I'm going to use, so the first option I'm going to have is Grey's Anatomy. So I'm going to set the ID to Grey's, set the name to medical, set the value to the same as the ID, which is Grey's, and then I'll add the associated label for that. So again, connect this with the input type. So I'm going to use the same ID. And then I want the option to show Grey's Anatomy. If I run this, we have our next question, which is what's your favorite medical show? And we have this radio button for Grey's Anatomy. Now notice the difference between radio buttons and checkboxes. Checkboxes allow you to select multiple options, and radio buttons allow you to select just one option. So that's the difference between both of them. I'm going to add a couple more options in here. So if I save this, run it, has all the options that we added, and it looks good. I'm going to do one more question, but I'm going to use a radio button as well. So I will just copy all of this and paste it down here. When you copy and paste, please don't forget to change all of the values, all of the IDs, and all of the things that show, because it's really, really, really easy to forget to change something. And then when you're writing the code in the back end, you start having errors because things aren't matched appropriately to what they're supposed to be matched to. So this next question is going to say, what's your favorite detective show? Actually, no, I want to do thriller. So what's your favorite thriller TV show? And then I'll add a couple of options here. I just saved this and I'm going to refresh my tab. And I think we have a good number of questions here. There's lots of other data types you can use. So there's drop-down lists, there's passwords, there's data list inputs, there's ranges, there's a whole lot of them you can use, and I'll include a link to check out all of them in the appendix of the lab document. The last thing I'm going to show you how to add to your form is a submit button. So again, I'm going to have my div. And for submit buttons, we will also use the input tag. In this case, we'll set the type to be submit. And then we can set the value if we want. So here I'm going to set the value to submit. And I'm going to give it an ID of submit button, just so we can easily identify it. If I save this, refresh my browser, and we have a submit button at the bottom. Right now we click on the submit button and it doesn't do anything, but there's a button here. Now the value for the submit button is completely optional. If we take it out and save it, if I refresh, it's still gonna say submit because the default text here is submit. And the way we set the text on the button is by using the value attribute. So if I change this to send and saved it, if I refresh, the button will say send. For this, I'm going to keep it as submit because I think that makes the most sense here. And now we've successfully created this form with a bunch of questions. Now that we have all this input here, we need to make this form actionable, right? So we need the submit button to do something. And when we enter that data, we want to be able to either store that data somewhere, use that data in order to write an algorithm that will calculate the results. To help us with that, we're going to go back to our form and then go to the opening tag of a form. Now in HTML, our form has a couple of attributes that can be very helpful for this. The first one is the action attribute. What this does is it helps us determine where the form information goes to. So in this case, I want all the data on my form, right? I want all this data to go to results.html, right? Because I want it to open up a new page that shows you the results. So I'm going to set this action to results.html. If I save this and run it, now when I answer all of the questions and I click submit, it goes to this new file, which is results.html. And the reason why this is blank is because there's nothing in this HTML file. So I'm going to go back. The next helpful attribute is going to be called the method attribute. As you can see here, there's 3 different options for the method. The most popular ones are get and post. And what this method attribute does is it helps us to determine how that information should be sent and processed. So action tells the form where to send that information, then the method tells the form how to send that information. In this lab, we're going to use the get method. And what the get method does is it sends this information as URL variables. If we use the post method will send that data so that we can handle it on the server side. However, that's going to be a bit complicated for this lab, and so we're just simply going to use the get method. So what do I mean when I say URL variables? Let me show you an example. So I've saved my file. I'm going to refresh my tab, and I'm going to answer these questions. Before I talk about the URL variables, if I answer the first question and leave all the other questions blank, when I click on submit, it still submits our form. But we don't necessarily want that, right? We want to force people to answer all the questions. We'll not force them, but we would like to at least have some of the data, right, before we click on the submit button. We don't want people submitting empty forms. One way we can do that is with a required attribute, and I'll use one example to show you. So I'm going to make the first question required. So what's your name? So I'm going to go back to our HTML page and go to the input tag associated with that box, right? And so it's the first one that we made. And I'm just going to add this attribute called required. Now, if I save that and I run this, if I answer all of the other questions and I click submit, it's not going to let me go on to the next page until I answer that question. So we can use that required attribute throughout our form to make questions compulsory if we want to. Now back to URL variables. So I'm going to run this one more time. I'm going to put in my name. I'll answer these questions and then submit. Now, if I expand this, I'm going to copy the text inside the search bar, and I'm going to paste that in my index.js file. So it looks like the URL is this long string, right? So it has where my document is stored. It's stored on my desktop in Lab02 folder, and the file is results.html. But it also has all of this data here, right? So we can see here fname is set equal to Farida, amount is set equal to 1, genre is equal to comedy. And so these are the options that I picked when I submitted the form, right? And these things are called URL parameters. If you notice, each new set of data is separated by an ampersand, right? So if I highlight all the ampersands, we see, okay, so the first set is the first name, then we have the amount, then we have the genres. Now notice here we have two genres, and that's because the question with the genres, right? So this one is the one with the checkboxes. And remember, with the checkboxes, you can click on as many options as you want. You can click on multiple options. And so that's why over here we have multiple genres. And then we have medical, and then we have thriller. This is very, very helpful because now we can just write code that helps to parse through this data. So we can write code that sorts through this data and collects the form answers for us. But before we do that, we need to link this JavaScript file to our HTML file. So I'm going to open up results.html. And the reason we're doing this in results.html is because if you remember from our form page, we set the action to results.html. Therefore, it sent all of the quiz responses to results.html, which is why that link is the one that had all of the data. So in our results.html file, we're going to set it up like a normal HTML file. Inside the head tag, we can link our HTML file to our JavaScript file by using a script tag. So we'll say script, and we'll set the source to our script, which is index.js. Then we'll save this, and now both of those files are connected. Let's try to print out these values. I'm going to copy and delete this, and we're going to try printing out. Remember when we talked about the DOM, so the document object model, and I mentioned that the head of the tree is the document, which is our entire HTML file. So in JavaScript, there's a keyword called document that references that entire document. And so in this case, we're going to use the document object, and we're going to use a function called location to get some info about our file. In order to print this out, in JavaScript, the way you print is you do console.log and then put the thing you want to print inside of your parentheses. Some general syntax rules for JavaScript: do not forget to add a semicolon to the end of your lines. So every single line has to have a semicolon at the end of it, otherwise it'll throw some errors and that wouldn't be pretty. So right now we've said log the document location, which is essentially print this document location onto our console. So I'm going to save this, and then I'll go back to my form, right? So let me refresh this, put in all the data, click on our favorite shows, submit. Now we're in results.html. In order to access your console, you have to double click on your page and click on inspect. When you do this, it opens up this neat little thing on the side here. And here you can access your console by clicking on console at the bottom of the file. You could also click on console at the top and it'll expand your console. So right now, this is what we're working with, and this is what's important. So if you notice, we said console.log the document location, and right here, it printed out the document location, which is exactly what we want. When we look at this, we'll see a couple of parameters inside of this object. Notice how it kind of looks like a dictionary with a bunch of keys and values associated. If we scroll through this, we'll notice that, for example, the href has the entire link, which is what I copied and pasted into the JavaScript file. That's good. The path name has just everything in the link up until the first question mark. So it has the path of the results, the HTML file. And there's this key down here called search that has only the file data, right? So it has only the parts of the string that we actually care about, which is the part that has the data that we're interested in looking for. Now, in our JavaScript file, we can access that using this key called search. And so here we can say document.location, we got that object, but now we want .search. So if I save this and I refresh my file, now it prints out only that string, which is exactly what we need, right? So now we found a way to get that string from our browser tab, like from the search tab. And now we have that essentially stored in this variable here, right? So we haven't created a variable yet, but we have it stored somewhere here. And now we can go through this string, parse through it, and get out the data that we need. To do this, there's an interface in JavaScript called URL search params. So if I open up Google and I do URL search params, it'll open up this page that has the documentation. Now it says URL search params is an interface that defines utility methods to work with the query string of a URL. And that's exactly what we have here. We have the query string of a particular URL, right? And so this interface is going to be super helpful to help us parse through that string. If you scroll through, you'll see that it has a bunch of methods, and we'll come back to this later. But essentially, we're going to use this interface. And the way we do that is so we'll create a variable. I'll call it params, and then we'll set that equal to new URL search params. And in here, I want to put the data that I want to parse through, right? So to make this easy, I'm going to create some variables. In JavaScript, to create variables, we can either use the constant keyword or we can use let. These are the major ones that people use. There's also var, which is var, but the most common ones are const and let. So the main difference between const and let variables is that one of them is essentially constant and the other can be redefined. And so the one that's constant is the one called const. And what this means is it's constant and it's immutable. So if we set a certain variable, so if we say const age equals 17, right? We cannot change this value anywhere else in this file, right? Once we set it to 17, it's going to be permanently 17. But with let, if we said let age equals 17, right? It's the same variable, which is why it's showing this red line under here. So let's just say let name equal 17, right? With name, if we set this to 17, somewhere later on in the file, we can redefine name to a different number if that changes, right? So we can update the value. And so because of this, we must always declare and initialize our variables. So for our constant variable here, whenever we declare it using this tag, we also have to initialize it, right? So we can't just say const age and then leave it like that and never define it. But with let, we can do that, so we can define it and then change it later on. Now, we'll see more examples of this as we work through the code, right? But in this case, when I want to make a variable for this object, I'm going to use const because for the URL parameter, I do not want it to be able to change. because that'll be very detrimental. It means we're changing the data that we received, right? So I'm just going to set this and say const data so that we don't change it at all. And I'm going to set it equal to document location.search, which is the URL parameter that we got here, the query string. Now remember, I said we can use this interface called URL search params to parse through this data. So I'm also going to set this variable, make it a const, and then in here, so inside this parenthesis, I'm going to put data. And essentially we're putting this variable inside of this bracket. Now that we've done this, so essentially we've made data a URL search param object. And now we can take advantage of any of the methods inside URL search param. So if we go back to the website, some of the methods that we see, there's .append, .delete, .entries, .get, get all has. The one that's important right now is .get. And what that does is it returns the first value associated with the given search parameter. So we're going to go back to our code. And then let's print out. So we'll say console.log and we'll say params, right, which is this variable, .get. And the first thing I want to print out, so if we go back to the query string, let's try printing out just the name. So I'll say get fname. I'll save that and I'll reload this file and it only prints the first name. So it only prints Verida, which is exactly what we wanted. Now that we don't have the query string anymore, you might be wondering, so how do I know what variable to put into these brackets? This is the reason why the name tag was very important when we were creating our input types, right? So fname that we've used here directly correlates to the name tags that we defined here. So in this case, fname will pull the value from that text box, and that's the value that is printing out. Amount will pull the value from the amount box, and that's the value that is printing out. For the ones that have multiple options, it would pull all the options that are checked, right? And I'll show you what that means when we're looking through that. So essentially, the names that we put in here in the JavaScript file are the names that we declared using the name variable. So back to our file. Now that we know we can use that, I'm just going to create this, make this a variable, right? Instead of having it print out. And this time, I'm still going to use the const variables because I don't want to be able to change this data. So I'm going to say make name this, and then I'm going to do it for all the other questions that we have. So we had name, we also had amount. So I'm going to say params.get, and I'll say amount. Go back to our form. The next one we had was genres, right? So here we'll say const genres params.get, and if we go back, we use the name genres. So we'll just use that same name here. And then I'll do it for the last two questions. Now, if you print out any of these variables using console.log, right? So let's say we want to print out genres, save it, run this, and it'll print out the value associated with that variable. One important thing to notice here, the genres variable, so remember the question with the genres was the question that used checkboxes. And when we looked at the query string, so if I go back here and we scroll through the query string, because users can pick multiple options, we have multiple variables that have all the options that were selected, right? But down here, it only printed out one option. So it only printed out drama instead of printing out drama and horror. And the reason for that is because we use the get method, and the get method only returns the first value associated with a given parameter. If we wanted to get all the values associated, we can use this method down here called getAll. So I'm going to go back to our code, and for the genres parameter, I'm going to say getAll instead of get. And now if I save this, if we print out genres, this will show us essentially a list, an array of all the checked values, right? So if I checked all the options that I had, it would have this array, and it will put drama, it will put horror, and it will put every other thing I checked. So that's one thing to note about checkboxes. Now we have all of the user data. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to write conditionals to determine what our outfit is. Now, remember when we first started, I said, so I'm going to make this question about TV shows, and then based on a TV show that a user selects, so based on the TV shows that they like, I'm going to determine what character they are. For me, I've decided that my characters are going to be colors. And so if someone, I'm going to go back to my form. So looking at this form, if someone said that they liked Grey's Anatomy and The Handmaid's Tale, which are one of my two favorite shows, I'm going to say that, they're a particular color, and I'm going to say that I think they have excellent taste. But if they picked like ER and Criminal Minds, for example, I'm going to be like, okay, these are good shows. You have an okay taste, but you don't have the best taste. And so to do that, I'm going to make a new variable, right? I'm going to call this variable characters. Notice here I use the let declaration instead of const, and that's because I want to be able to change this value later down in my code. And now we're going to write a bunch of if statements. So we write if statements in JavaScript very similar to how we write if statements in Python, but instead we use curly braces instead of a colon. So here I'm going to say if medical, right? So if the medical is equal to something and thriller is equal to something. In JavaScript, we use the two ampersand symbols to represent and. Remember in Python, we have like and, or, in, not. In JavaScript, and is this, or is this, and I'm pretty sure in and not work similarly, but I think not might be the exclamation mark instead, but we'll see more of that as we go along. Just know that you use the double ampersand for and the two vertical lines for or. Now, so I'm going to say if the medical is equal to Grey's Anatomy, or if the thriller is equal to Handmaid's Tale, then I want to set the character to be something. Now remember, when we printed out, so when we logged, I'm going to log both the medical show and the thriller to our console so I can show you something. So I'll submit. Notice how it prints out ER and C minds. If you look at the form, it says ER, but it says Criminal Minds, not C minds. So why is it that when we print out that variable, it prints out ER and C minds, some form of like shortcut? And the reason why is because of the values. So remember when we were doing the multi-option questions, I said the value attribute was super important, and this is the reason why. So the value that we set for the ER show was just, the small letters E and R. And the value we set for Criminal Minds was C Minds. And those are the values that get printed out. So it's super important. You have to keep track of what IDs am I using, what name attributes am I using, and what values am I using, because that's what's going to help us when we're writing our script. And so in this case, I'm going to say if medical is equal to grays, so if medical is equal to grays, and if thriller is equal to handmade, in this case, I think the character should be elite. I used the wrong variable, so let me just change this. So character should be equal to elite. I'm going to have an else if statement. And I'm going to say, okay, if medical is, let's say ER, and thriller is Killing Eve, which I think we used as key, right? Then this character is just, I'll say superb. And then I'm going to do two more. So otherwise, if medical is, because we had like 4 options, right? Okay. So if medical is Chicago Med, and thriller is Ozark, then this character is just okay. And then for the last one, I'm going to put else so that it catches all the other combinations that I haven't accounted for. So for example, what happens if someone picks Grey's Anatomy and they pick Killing Eve, right? That's not a combination we've accounted for. And so I'm going to have an else statement that accounts for all those other combinations that we didn't think of. And so I'm going to say characters should just be met. I didn't spell characters right again. So let me just correct this. And so we've written these if statements that will print out the type of character that you are, or it'll define the type of character you are based on the answers that you gave in the form. So just to test this out, I'm going to print out the console. Sorry, I'm going to print out the characters and then show you that it works. So I'll go back to my form and I'll refresh. So I'll say my name is Farida. I watch like 50 different TV shows. Well, let's say 11. Pick comedy. I'll pick Grey's Anatomy and then I'll pick Ozark. Now, based on the if statements we have here, there's no combination of Grey's and Ozark, and so we'll expect that to print meh. So I'll submit and it prints out meh. If I go back, if I change my options to, let's say Chicago Med and Ozark, or let's say Scrubs, I'll do ER and Killing Eve. If I submit this, it'll print out superb because that's the second one. Right, so this works exactly how we want it to. And that's the end of the logical statements. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to write HTML code based on these if statements. So essentially, I'm going to say, if a character is a lit, then I want to display a particular web page, and I want to display a particular set of results on this web page. And then we'll say if a character is okay, then I want to display a particular set of results on this page, right? So we're basically going to account for all of these options. And there's a very, very simple way to do this. There's multiple ways to do it, but I'm going to do it the simplest way here. And the simplest way is to write HTML code within our JavaScript file. again, we're going to take advantage of this document object, right? So remember, this document is this whole HTML file, and we have access to all the elements inside of this document, and we can call methods on those elements. So inside the body of my file, in my results.html, I'm going to create a div. I'm just going to set the ID of this to results. So inside of this div, I want to display some certain results, right? So I'm going to save this and go back to my JavaScript file. And here I'm going to say document, right? Dot. I'm going to use the advantage of the get element method. So I'm going to say get element by ID, right? And in here, we can put the ID of any of the elements inside of our HTML file. So I'm going to use the results ID. I'll put that in here and then end with my colon. So I'm going to set this to be equal to a variable that we can manipulate. So I'll say, make this container. And this container should hold document.getElement by ID results. So I want this container to essentially be that div that we created. And what we can do is make use of this neat function called innerHTML. And so I'm going to say .innerHTML. And we can set some HTML variables in here, right? So inside of this div, if we wrote like a bunch of code, like we could write like a heading, we could write a paragraph. If we wrote anything inside that code, essentially we're just going to be doing that with JavaScript instead. And the way we do that is using innerHTML. So I'm going to say inside of that div, I want to put a paragraph. The syntax in here follows the exact HTML syntax, but you have to be really, really careful because in JavaScript, in Visual Studio Code, it doesn't tell you whether you're missing a closing tag. It doesn't auto-complete the closing tags for you like it would in a normal HTML file. So you have to be really, really careful about syntax in here. Otherwise, it might throw an error. And so I'm going to change this to a heading instead. So I'm going to make this H1. And inside of this heading, I want to print out UR. And so remember, if they choose Grace and Handmade, I'm going to say you are elite. If they choose ER and Killing It, I'm going to say they're superb. If they choose these, I want to say this. And so we have this variable defined here called characters that already has the variable that we want. And so we could just put characters in here. And the way we do that is we use this really cool notion that's similar to dot format in Python. So you add the $sign and then you add the curly braces. And then in here, we could just say character. I'm going to add an exclamation mark just for special effects. And I'm going to save this, go back to my form. So I refreshed, answer a couple of questions, pick a couple of options, and then submit. Now we're getting this error here that says it's coming from line 26 of index.js. This is our index.js, and line 26 is this line that we have here. And the error that says the prints out is uncaught type error, cannot set properties of null. Now the reason why we're getting this error is because of the DOM model, the DOM object model that we talked about in the beginning. And so what's happening is that because of this DOM structure, remember, the DOM is our entire document. And in this case, the DOM is results.html, right? The document is this entire file. Now remember, in Python, we run code from top to bottom, and that's the same in almost every other language. So in results.html, our code, when it processes, when it opens up this document, it opens up this document from top to bottom. So the first thing it does is it, sets the head title, and then it sets the script. Now, when we set the script, it effectively opens up this JavaScript file and then runs everything inside of this file. Now, the reason why that's a problem is because by the time this file runs, we haven't defined the div with the ID of results, right? That happens later on in the script. So it happens once we're done processing this file, then it goes to the next line, and then it creates this div. So at the point at which this file is running, we haven't created any element that has the ID of results. And that's what's causing this error. And that's why the error says cannot set properties of null, because here container is going to return null because nothing exists. And then when we try to do null.innerHTML, JavaScript is like, I can't perform this action on a null object. So to solve this, we're going to add something called an event listener. And so we're going to ask our document, right, to listen for an event. And the way we can do this is, I recommend adding this to the top of the file, but we'll call our document object, and then we'll use this method called add event listener. So the event we want to listen for in this case, so this is going to take in 2 parameters. The first parameter is what event do you want this document to listen out for? And so we're going to say we want you to listen out for DOM content loaded. And what this means is that I want you to load all of the content in this DOM first, right? And then listen out for that action. So once this whole file is done loading, then I want you to do something. And the thing we want it to do is what we put in the second parameter. So here, I'm going to put a function called postData. And we'll define this function later on. So here, we've effectively said, listen out for when the DOM content is loaded. And when the DOM content has finished loading, run this function called postData. And so down here, I'm going to create a function called postData. So the way we create functions in JavaScript is we write the keyword function, the name of our function. If we had any parameters, we'll put them into this parenthesis, but we don't. So we'll create that. And then I'm going to put all of this into my function call. Again, what this means is we've said document, once you're done loading, run the function postData. And that's going to solve the problem because it will load all of the data in this file first. So it'll run the script, it'll create this body, it'll create this div, and then we'll recall the function postData, right? Which will then add this HTML to our file. So let's save this and test it out. So there's no error showing up anymore. So I'm going to close the console. And now it prints out your character. But we don't want it to print out you are a character. Like I said, we want it to print out all of these. The reason why this is happening is because whenever we want to set inner HTML content in JavaScript, we have to use multi-line comments. And what that essentially is, so we use multi-line strings, and they're called template literals, right? So instead of using the normal parentheses / quotes that we use Instead, we want to use this curved quote. It's not curved, it's more like slanted. If you're using a Mac, it's right beside the number 1. And what this would do is, first of all, it allows us to write comments or strings that can span multiple lines, right? So all of the stuff in here will still run like it's under this. And it also allows us to write, inner HTML stuff. And you'll know this worked because this variable characters that we've put in here turns blue. And then the curly braces and the $sign is purple. So if I save this and I run it, now it prints out your elite. And so if we go back to our form, reload. So we're going to test this out with the options that we have. Let me just make this window smaller. So we have name, so you can say F, 1 TV show, comedy action. I'll choose Grays and Handmade. So Grays and Handmade. And again, we'll expect that to print you are elite. So submit, and it says you're elite. If we go back, if we change, so if we say ER and Killing Eve instead, so ER, Killing Eve, it'll say you're superb. And that works exactly how we want it to, right? So the content of this web page is changing depending on the options that we put into the form. Now we can do a lot more on this HTML page. So for example, we can add an image depending on what character you are. So if I go back to our file, I'm going to do this by creating another variable called image. And so in here, I will then redefine image, right? So depending on the character, I want to give each character a specific image. So we have the images folder right here. And I'm going to put a couple of images in here. Now you can easily just drag and drop. So I've downloaded a couple of images. So I'll add black. So we dropped it into this folder. I'll rename this to black. I'll also add green, because I like green. I'll rename this to green. And then I'll add a couple more colors. So one for okay and one for meh. Now this is just the quickest way to add these images, but it's not the only way, right? So you could easily go into the folder where you have your lab saved, open up the images folder and just add the images into that folder. That's another way to do it, but both things would work. And so I'm going to save this. And here where I have the image, I'm going to put the source path of the image. And the reason why is because remember in HTML, when we want to add an image, we use the image tag, right? I'm going to try to keep this aligned. So use the image tag, and this image tag will take in a source, and that source is the file path, so the file path of the image that we want to add. And so in this case, I'm going to put the $sign and the curly brackets, and I'll set this to equal to image, right? So we have the source. Essentially, we're going to replace the text here with whatever source we put in here. Now, the quickest way to add the source for each of the colors is by double clicking on the color folder. So the color file in here, double click on it, and then copy the relative path, not the file path. If you copy the path, it wouldn't run when you submit your files. So copy the relative path and then paste it in here. And that would work perfectly. So I'm going to do that for the rest of them. So now if I save this and we run this, so rerun, my name, number, choose an option, ER and Killing Eve, submit. It says you are superb, and then it puts the image of the color, right? So superb was green. And so it says you're superb and it puts green. If we go back, if we try a different combination and we submit, it'll say you're elite and then it put the black color. If we go back, try any other options, you're mad and it puts a green color. So now we've effectively created this web page that's dynamic. It changes the output depending on the responses in the form on this page. And that's exactly how we want this to work. So it kind of works like a BuzzFeed quiz, answer a couple of questions, and we tell you, some new thing about your personality. I'm going to add a couple of styling to both of these files. To do that, we're going to use our index.css file. Now, if you remember from Lab 1, to link your CSS file to your HTML files, you go to the head tag, and inside this tag, use link. And then you set the relative attribute to style sheet, the type to text/CSS, and then the link. And so for this, to avoid any errors, I'm just going to click on this file and then copy the relative file path and then paste that in here. I'm going to do the same thing. So I've decided to use one file for both of my HTML files. So I'm going to add that into my results.html as well. And so a couple of quick things I'm going to do. I'm going to add a border around this form. So I'm going to go to form. I can just call the form tag. So I'll say form. And then to add a border, I'll say border. And then I'll set this to 1 pixel, solid, and I want it to be like light gray. So I'll make it D3, 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 which is a light gray. If we save this and we run this file, it's added this border around the form. Perfect. Another thing, I'm going to set a width. So I don't want this form to be bigger than 500 pixels, right? I think it's too huge. So I'll set the maximum width and see that way it makes all the content of the form a maximum width of 550 pixels. I'll add some margin just so we can have a bit of spacing. And that way the box is essentially in the middle of our page, regardless of how we resize it. I think it's too crowded in here, so I'm going to add padding. Then I'll save this. And so we've added a bit of space. See how with just 4 lines of code, we've made this like a bit more pleasant. And now you can change this however you want, add spacing, add colors. We put a couple of like styling requirements as part of the assignment so that you can make this look good. Now, I'm also going to show you how to style the other file. And it works the way the styling for this file works, right? So remember, this file, this document, is just results.html. Regardless of whether we wrote the code in a JS file, all of this code is essentially still in this file, right? And then we've added this style sheet into our file in here. So I'm going to call this ID results, and I'm going to apply some of the similar styles in here. I'm going to call the ID results. And the reason this works, the reason we can do this effectively with no confusion is because within these both files, there's only one ID called results, right? And so the index.css file automatically knows which file we're talking about and which div we're talking about. So again, I'm going to set the border. I'm just going to copy all of this because I want to apply the same rules. So I'll open up my file, reload it. You can't see it right now, but we have the width of 500 pixels. We have our title in here and we have our image in here. But our picture is too big and so it's spilling out of this box. So what I'm gonna do is get the image tag and I'm going to change the width and the height of that picture. So I'm going to make the width 550, which is the same as the size of the box. And I'm going to make the height 200 pixels. I'm going to save that, run it, and now it looks good. So if we go back, we have this box, we submit, we have this box that looks good. So these are just a couple of styles I have chosen to show in here, but I'm not going to do a deep dive because you learned a bit more about like CSS and HTML in Lab 1 and you know how to do these things already. Now that we're done, our work is essentially complete. We've created this form, put in a couple of questions, and whenever users respond / answer the questions in this form, they submit, and the output changes depending on the input. So for this lab, we've created a couple of requirements, and I'm going to explain a couple of them so there's no confusion. For the first one, the quiz that you create must have at least 5 quiz questions with multi-options. What does that mean? This means that you must have at least 5 questions that use either checkboxes, radio buttons, or drop-down lists. So you need to have at least 5 questions that allow users to select between a couple of inputs, right? So the text box and the number boxes aren't multi options, right? Because they can only input one thing and submit. It doesn't give them options. For the multi options, these are checkboxes, drop-down lists, or radio buttons. The next requirement is that the entire form must use at least 3 different types of input. This can range from drop-down to checkboxes to text to the submit button to radio buttons. And so in here, I've used 1, 2, 3, 4 different types, right? So I've already met the minimum requirements. However, I haven't met the requirement that I need to have 5 questions with multi-options because I only have 3. So you need to have 5 questions with multi-options, and then you also need to use at least 3 different types of inputs in your entire form. The next thing is that your lab must contain at least 4 different logic statements, which produce 4 different outputs. The logic statements are the if statements that we defined in our JavaScript file. So I have 1 logic statement, second one, third one, and you could call this a 4th one, right? So I have 4 logic statements here, and each of them produce a different output. Now for this, depending on how many questions you have, right? So if you have 5 questions and each question has 5 different options, then that's so many combinations you need to account for. And that's why we're saying that you only have to use 4 different logic statements. So you only need to account for 4 different combinations, and then have an else statement that accounts for any other combination that you forgot to include. And that way your code wouldn't error out if you choose any different mix of options. So have at least 4 logic statements, and then you must have an else statement that accounts for all of the other different combinations that you didn't account for. Within this, it says each logic statement must use one option from each quiz question to determine its outputs. Now, what does this mean? So remember, you need to have 5 questions with multi-options and at least 4 logic statements. Now, inside of those 4 logic statements, so for example, with this first one, you need to have something that accounts for each of the 5 questions that you've included, right? So in here, I've only accounted for 2 of my questions, right? I didn't account for the TV genres, and I don't even have enough questions. But you need to have 5 questions with multi-options, and each logic statement needs to essentially use at least one option from each question. So if I had an additional question here that said, I guess, what's your favorite comedy show, right? Then I must use that question in my logic statement. The next thing is each output displayed must have a title text, image, and a descriptive sentence. What that means is that your output page must have a title, an image, and a paragraph. So this one is missing a paragraph, but it has a title and an image. Now, those are the only minimum requirements, but feel free to go above and beyond and add as many things as you want to this page. Lastly, there's a bunch of styling requirements, and you can add as many other things as you want. Feel free to be creative. So the last thing I'm going to show you is what a sample output can look like. So this is what a sample final lab submission can look like. So I've cleaned up the form, added a couple more questions, added some colors, spaced things out. And so this could look like a sample output. I can answer some of these questions. This is a drop-down list. And then my submit button goes to the next page. And it has a text, has an image, and it has a paragraph.